Hi fourth graders, it's Mrs. Burke and I'm back with another video lesson. This is an exciting week because you're beginning the unit of decimals. So the trickiest part about decimals is we are going to have to retrain our brain to think a little bit differently about our base 10 blocks and what they represent. Because since about kindergarten or first grade, you've seen these base 10 blocks and you've been told that this cube represents a 1 and it has a value of 1. Then when you have 10 cubes, you can regroup it to a long, which has 10 in it, and then when you get 10 longs, you can regroup it to a flat, which has 100, right? So you've been told that for many, many, many years, and that's true. You can use those as representations when you're dealing with whole numbers. But now that we have decimals, we're going to be dealing with whole numbers and numbers that are smaller than a whole. So if you think about money, if you have $1 and then you find some change, you don't have $2, you might just have $1.25. So these values here represent that they're not a whole yet. They're a part that's smaller than a whole, okay? So we have to now give these base 10 blocks new names, and they'll represent new values. So again, this is what we used to believe our base 10 blocks represented, and now they're going to change, okay? So now we are going to call our flat 1 whole, our long 1/10, and our cube 100. So if I have 2 flats, these are no longer going to be 200. Instead, 1 whole and another whole is 2. So this just has a value of 2. 2 pizzas, 2 cakes, $2. If I cut them into 10 parts, 10 of these will make my whole. So I'm going to call these now tenths, and tenths are smaller than a whole. And it sounds weird to say tenth is smaller than 1 because when we think of the word 10, we know 10 is larger than 1, but this is not a 10, this is a tenth, okay? And it's spelled with the TH. Now when I take a tenth and I make it 10 times smaller, or I cut it into 10 more pieces, each little piece is going to be called 100th. And why is it 100th? Because 100 of these will fill up my whole. So 100 of these make a whole, so we call them hundredths. So these are your new place values: wholes, tenths, and hundredths. Wholes we've worked with before, but now we're going to add tenths and hundredths. And if we think about it in relation to each other, from largest to smallest, my whole is the largest, then my tenth, and then my hundredth is the smallest. Even though we see that word 100, it doesn't mean it's large. It actually means it's super small because we need 100 of them to get back to this whole, okay? If we look at it as a decimal, we have 1 whole. This decimal represents 1/10, and that decimal represents 100th. And that would be a flat to a long to a cube, largest to smallest. Okay. So now we're going to look at some decimals and think about what numbers they represent. So if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 of these, think about what we call the cubes now. We call them hundredths. So if I have 4 of them, I call them 4 hundredths. And I would write that. So I'm just going to put place values here. Just bear with me for 1 second. Okay, so I have 4 hundredths. So my decimal point is always in between my whole and my tenth. That never moves. So I have 4 hundredths. I don't have any tenths, and I didn't have any wholes. So I had 4 hundredths. Now, let's say I also added in a long. What does a long represent? A tenth. So now I have a tenth and 4 hundredths. So what number does that represent? Well, go back to your whole. I'm trying to make up this whole eventually. If I have tenth and then 4 more ones, right? Sorry, not ones. 4 more cubes or hundredths. What do I have total out of this? I have 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And we're going to call them all hundredths because our goal was to make a new whole. But so far we only have 14 of them. So we had 1/10 and 4 hundredths. So we had 14 hundredths. All right. Let's take a look here. I have a couple on my sheet. So for question A, I can see that my whole was split only into 10 parts. You can see the flat in the background, and I can see it was split into 10 parts. Now let me count how many are shaded. Well, I know there would be 10 parts in all. All of them except one are shaded, so this would be 9/10 are shaded, or 9 longs. So I write that as 9/10. Now let's look at the next one. Again, this was cut into how many parts? 10. And how many were shaded? Just one of them. So I had 1/10 was shaded. Okay, let's look at the one next to it. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 longs, or 4/10. Now I can write that as 4/10. Okay? So that tenths are when we are only dealing with longs. That's it. Now sometimes we're going to get some hundredths mixed in with these tenths. So let's take a look at those. So let's look at this question right here. Here, my whole, you can see the whole, is no longer split into just 10 rows. Now I have 100 that make up this whole. So if I want to count how many are shaded, I could count individually, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or I know every row is going to have 10. So I can count by tens, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, because I have 6 full rows, but then I have these little ones, 61, they're hundredths, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66. So it would take 100 of these to make my whole. What do I have? I have 66 of the hundredths. So I would write it like this. 66 hundredths. Let's look at the next one. 10, 20, 30, 40, because there are 4 rows of 10, or hundredths are all of them. So 40 hundredths, 41, 42, 43. So that would be 43 hundredths. Try this one on your own. What value do you think is represented there? Okay, make sure you try to write it as a decimal. Say it as a decimal and then try to write it. All right, so I see I have 1 full row of 10, 2 full rows, so that's 20 hundredths. It would have been 3 full rows, but I was missing 2 of them, so that means there's 8 there. So I have 28 hundredths, and I write that as a decimal like this, 28 hundredths. All right, now we're gonna kind of mix in wholes, longs, and cubes. All right, so let me just give this a quick erase. slide these in. Okay. All right, let's try some of these. So first, my first picture. I have how many holes first? Let me count my largest place value because it's the entire flat. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 holes. So I'm gonna write that 5 holes. Now I'm gonna come to values that are less than a hole. So I need my decimal point. So that's why I put my decimal point. So let me count how many tenths I have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tenths. And now let me count how many, what is the next place value called? The smallest one? Hundredths. I have 1, 2, 3 hundredths. So I'm gonna write my 3 in my hundredths place. So this total value is 5 holes. And when we see a decimal point, we don't say point, we just say the word and. 5 and 63 hundredths. Let's look at our next one. First, let me count my largest place value first. All right. So I have how many holes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 holes. All right, now this next part's a little tricky. Do I have any longs or tenths? No, those are not tenths, those are hundredths. I don't have any of these for my second example, but I have to show that I don't have any, so I'm gonna put a 0 in my tenths place. So far I have 7 and 0 tenths, and now let me count how many hundredths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm gonna write a 5 in my hundredths place. So this represents 7 and 5 hundredths. All right, last one, let's see. Let me start by counting my holes. 1, 2, 3, 4 holes. So I'm gonna put my 4. Now comes my decimal point because I'm getting to parts that are less than a hole. Ready? Let's see. How many tenths? Those are the longs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tenths. Do I have any hundredths? Nope. Now I could just stop there, but I like to put a 0 to show that I checked for hundredths, but I didn't see any. So 4 and 90 hundredths. All right. So that is how we can read place value based on what's being represented. My biggest tip is that you have to retrain your brain. So this is going to take practice. This is no longer 100. This is now a whole. This is no longer a 1. We now call this a hundredth. And what do we call our longs now? Tenths. So it's all about retraining our brain. Practice, practice, practice. And you'll get better and better, okay? So we have, again, the holes, which is our flat, the tenths place, and then the hundredths. This is our largest. The ones place now is our largest place, which we're used to that being the smallest. Then comes the tenth, and the biggest surprise of all is that that hundredths is actually our smallest place value. Even though you see that word 100 in there, that TH is very important and actually tells us that they're this small because it takes 100 of them to turn back into our whole. Okay? So good luck today with your assignments. Practice hard, and you'll get better and better each day, I promise. And I miss you guys, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Have a great day, Stuart.